It's a cold Saturday evening in March of 1984 in Columbus, Ohio. On the north side of the city, on a quiet, well-kept block, sits 5242 Blue Ash Road. A lovely brick and stucco home. The house belonged to Joan and John Resch, a well-regarded couple in their early 50s, who were known for their generosity and community service. They had one biological son, Craig, who was in his late teens, an adoptive daughter, Tina, who was 14, and several foster children living with them in this house. Joan loved children and wanted to provide a safe and loving home for as many as she could. She sometimes housed 6 foster kids at a time. On the evening of March 3rd, Joan was in her kitchen, washing dishes, when movement just outside her peripheral vision caught her attention. She looked up from her sink and noticed something strange was happening with the clock on her wall. Both hands of the clock were spinning rapidly. Around and around they went, never stopping at a particular hour. Joan put down the dish she was washing, turned the sink off, and walked closer to the clock. She reached to take it off the wall, but then the kitchen lights turned off. Joan was plunged into darkness. It only lasted for a few seconds, though, because the lights suddenly turned back on. The second time they flashed on and off, Joan rolled her eyes. Joan lived in a house full of children. Pranks and mischief were a part of everyday life for her. She walks back over to the sink to finish washing the dishes, demonstrating to whichever child is flipping the lights on and off that she is unaffected by their game. She continues her cleaning, but she is suddenly startled by the loud beep of the microwave turning on. A second after the microwave turns on, several things happen at once. The television in the living room turns on, the volume blaring. The garbage disposal starts to grind loudly. The washer and dryer in the laundry room both start to spin. Startled by the explosion of noise, Joan quickly moves to shut everything off. She runs into the living room to turn off the loud TV, but the remote doesn't work. She presses the power button on the TV, but again, the video and sound still play. It's when she unplugs the television that she feels a chill go down her spine. Because despite pulling the cord from the wall, the television is still on. Joan cannot figure out how to turn off the television. And even stranger, there are no children anywhere in the room that could be causing this to happen. Joan's husband, John Resch, comes home to find his wife in a frazzled state. She tells him about all the appliances and lights turning on and off, and suggests power surges are causing the strange activity. When John can't figure out what is going on either, he calls an electrician. When the electrician arrives, of course, all the activity stops. Everything appears completely normal. He checked the breaker box, the outlets, and tried to find any hot spots, but he found nothing. The electrician told the Reschs that nothing seemed wrong in the house. But, as he stepped out through the front door, the lights began to switch on and off again. The electrician knew there were several children in the house, and like Joan, now he assumed someone was playing a prank. The electrician put pieces of tape on all the light switches in their eye line, and then the three of them waited. And waited. Nothing happened. It seemed as though the tape proved that one of the children were flicking the lights on and off. Just as the electrician was about to leave again, a lamp on the far side of the living room suddenly switched on. No one was near it. When the electrician walked over to the switch, the tape that he had eyes on moments ago was gone. The electrician couldn't explain what was happening. He left the confused couple, unable to help them. This wouldn't be the last strange activity to happen in Joan and John Resch's home. In fact, it would only get worse. And as the activity increased, the Reschs began to notice one constant. Their teenage daughter, Tina, was always in the house when the issues occurred. They began to suspect that Tina was causing the strange activity, but they didn't believe she was trying to pull a prank on them anymore. Instead, they believed that Tina was possessed by something supernatural, or rather, was supernatural herself. This is part 1 of the story of the Columbus Poltergeist, otherwise known as the story of Tina Resch. Hi, strangers. Today we have our first semi-supernatural episode of the podcast. Are you excited? If not, don't worry, because there is still a heavy dose of true crime in this episode. And with that, I want to make a quick disclaimer that while this episode will discuss the paranormal, the crime that is committed towards the end of this story is very real and, unfortunately, involves a child. So listener discretion is strongly advised. And with that, lock your doors and listen closely. This is Stranger in the House. In March of 1984, Mike Harding was a reporter for the Columbus Dispatch. He wrote a variety of stories, but he tended towards human interest pieces. That past October, he had written a story about Mrs. Joan Resch and her outstanding work for foster children. Joan and her husband John had cared for over 200 children throughout their years as foster parents. The couple had won dozens of awards because of their commitment to the welfare of children in Columbus and were well regarded in their community. Mike Harding had enjoyed writing about the lovely couple, so when he received a call from Joan one morning in March, he was happy to hear from her. But the subject of Joan's call was not something Mike was expecting. According to William Rawls' book, Unleashed, of Poltergeists and Murder, the curious story of Tina Resch, Mike would have thought it was a prank call if he had not already known Joan's character. Joan needed help. She believed that her 14-year-old daughter, Tina, had developed supernatural powers and was causing chaos in her home. Normally, the Resch household is filled with foster children, but right now it was just Tina and the Resches because they feared for the children's safety. Appliances turned themselves on without an electric current. Objects flew through the air. Furniture scooted across the floor. The activity only occurred when Tina was in the house. Joan had even contacted the church to conduct an exorcism. Apparently, during the exorcism, all the electricity in the house went haywire, and the priest had to give up after several hours of trying to make it stop. Mike was the ultimate skeptic of the paranormal, but he knew Joan and could hear the fear in her voice. She wasn't looking for a story to be written about her family. She was seeing if Mike knew anyone in his contacts that could help. At 10:30 that morning, Mike made his way to the Resch household on Blue Ash Road to see what was going on for himself. He met with Joan and John, and met their daughter, Tina. Tina was 14 with light brown hair and brown eyes. She was precocious. She had a lot of energy that needed to be burned. That frenetic energy caused her to be extremely clumsy. She would knock into walls daily. When Mike stepped inside the family home that morning, strange things started to happen right away. While he was standing by the front, talking with Joan, he saw a pile of paper shoot off from atop a table and onto the floor. Tina, nor anyone else, was anywhere near the table. And it was winter in Ohio. No windows were open for a breeze to come through. When he sat down in the living room to discuss what had happened, he sat directly across from Tina. Him on the main couch and she on a recliner. While they were talking, Mike said that a toy cradle that was sitting on the floor flipped in the air and landed perfectly upside down. Mike had brought the dispatch photographer, Fred Shannon, with him for this visit, and while Mike was talking to Tina, Fred was snapping photos of the teenager on the couch. Fred had been taking a photo at the exact same time the landline phone receiver flew off a side table and across the room. Fred's photo would show Tina sitting on the recliner and a phone floating above her. Mike had been looking at Tina in the recliner the whole time and couldn't explain how it could be her doing this. But it had to be her according to Joan and John Resch, because the activity only happened when Tina was in the house. When she was at school or church, none of this happened. But Joan and John Resch were strangely not surprised that this supernatural activity was connected to 14-year-old Tina, because Tina had always been a little different. Tina was born on October 23rd, 1969. She was abandoned by her birth parents when she was a few years old and was quickly adopted by Joan and John Resch. Despite growing up in a house with other children, Tina never seemed to be able to connect with her peers. She was easily excitable and often had outbursts that startled the people around her. She was clumsy, constantly knocking into walls and corners. According to the book Unleashed, Tina suffered from bouts of dizziness and had extreme temper tantrums when she was frustrated. It was like Tina was bubbling over with energy that she just couldn't release properly. Looking at the situation objectively, it seems as though Tina needed a lot of attention, but unfortunately, she lived in a very crowded house full of foster children who split her parents' attention. She was mercilessly bullied by her classmates and even some of her teachers because of her quirks. At one point, boys from her school pushed her into oncoming traffic. Tina was physically okay, but she told her parents and the school punished the boys. But the bullies got their revenge. After the incident, Tina was riding to school on the bus when one of the boys who pushed her yelled out to the bus driver. He said, "Tina is having a seizure." All the other children chimed in about the seizure, and the bus driver pulled over. The driver didn't see a seizure, but Tina was sent home to rest either way. Later at school, the children bragged that they had gotten rid of Tina for the day. Tina was a misunderstood kid, and Mike Harding wanted to tell the world her story. After his experience at the Resch home, Mike wrote a story that turned Tina's life upside down. The Columbus Dispatch published Mike's account of what was happening at the house, titled "Strange Happening, Unnerved Family." And just like that, the Resch home became a media zoo. Reporters, believers, and skeptics alike swarmed to the house to try and interview the family with the quote, "Poltergeist girl." Now for some context. Mike's article came out in March of 1984. The movie, Poltergeist, directed by Tobe Hooper, came out a little less than 2 years earlier.
They're here.
The movie was a cultural phenomenon and was the 8th highest grossing movie of 1982. The plot of the popular film had a lot of similarities to what was allegedly happening in the Resch home. A family is terrorized by unseen spirits that move their furniture, control their electronics, and even possess inanimate objects, like a very scary clown doll. Even more similar, the activity in the film is connected to the young daughter in the house. Tina's story quickly spread as the real-life poltergeist. Now, it should be said that Tina Resch, like almost everyone in America, had watched the film. Skeptics believed that she had seen the film and was copying what she saw to get attention from her parents. And while this is a valid theory, Mike Harding and the Resch family just couldn't believe that Tina would be able to pull off a large-scale hoax like this. After his experience, Mike called Duke University's famous psychology lab and asked to speak to someone who had expertise on objects that moved on their own. This request led Mike to William Roll. William was a psychologist and parapsychologist on the faculty of the psychology department of the University of West Georgia in Carrollton. And to my true crime lovers who don't normally dabble in paranormal stories, parapsychology is the study of alleged psychic phenomena, mind reading, telekinesis, that sort of thing. Obviously, this is considered a pseudoscience, but William Roll believed he could mix the scientific theory with the paranormal. He had written 3 books on the subject at this point, including 1972's The Poltergeist. Let's break down the term poltergeist. It's a German word that refers to a ghost or spirit that is responsible for physical disturbances in a home, such as loud noises and objects being moved or destroyed. Typical signs of a poltergeist would be movement or levitation of objects such as furniture and cutlery, or noises such as knocking on doors. Foul smells are also associated with poltergeist occurrences, as well as spontaneous fires and different electrical issues, like flickering lights. Through his research, William Roll believed that the phenomena of poltergeists were not caused by ghosts, but were a result of someone in the home developing spontaneous psychokinesis, the ability to move physical objects with their mind. Now, obviously this theory, as well as the idea that poltergeists even exist, faced an immense amount of skepticism. Psychical researcher Frank Podmore proposed the naughty little girl theory for most reported poltergeist cases, because most claims of poltergeist activity usually center around an adolescent girl living in the house. Through his research, Podmore found that the center of these types of disturbances was often a child who was throwing objects around to fool or scare people for attention. When Mike Harding called his department, William Roll knew that Tina could be one of these adolescent girls faking paranormal activity to get attention. But something about the way Mike spoke about what he saw at the Resch house made him think it could possibly be real. Either way, William was intrigued. So a few days later, William arrived in Ohio to investigate what the hell was going on at the Resch home. When William Roll arrived at the Resch's, he noticed Tina's clumsiness right away. As she gave him a tour of the house, she bumped into several walls and tripped over her own feet. In his book, Unleashed, he remembers thinking that Tina wouldn't be good at sleight of hand and wasn't smooth enough to trick someone in front of their face. Despite this, William remained skeptical of Tina. At one point, while he was in a different room, he heard a crash. The landline phone had flown off the wall and smashed into Tina's arm. Joan had allegedly witnessed it, but William thought it could have been staged. At dinner with the family, William noticed that they only used paper plates and styrofoam cups. Not because they didn't have real plates, but because they feared one of them could fly off the table at any moment and break. Despite the family's obvious belief in the supernatural activity, William really couldn't say for sure if Tina was experiencing spontaneous psychokinesis. Tina was always close to the objects he saw move and was never in the room when other activity happened. In one incident, a picture fell from a wall in an upstairs room where Tina was, but William was facing away from the picture when it fell. In the end, William Roll couldn't say for sure what was happening in the Resch home, but he wanted to do more research. William Roll brought Tina back to North Carolina with him to meet psychiatrist and experienced hypnotherapist Janine Lagel, as well as a group of paranormal researchers. During her time in North Carolina, Tina underwent brain scans, saw therapists, and participated in a parapsychology conference. She grew close to Roll and Lagel, but in the end, the research had to be put on hold and Tina was sent back home to Ohio. But this wouldn't be the last time Tina and William's paths would cross, however, because 8 years later, William Roll would be back in Columbus, Ohio, attending the funeral of Tina Resch's alleged murder victim. With the research ending and skeptics calling out Mike Harding's article as fake, the fever for Tina's story died down. The stigma still followed Tina, however. Here is Tina talking about how she felt about the world knowing her story.
Anybody who knows about this is gonna look at me like I'm crazy. And it's just another thing to be different. It doesn't end. Because I can't cover up my past and I can't hide it from anyone. So it's right out there in plain view. I feel vulnerable to it.
When Tina returned to her home in Columbus, Ohio, she immediately wanted to leave. Joan and John had resented her for all the issues she had caused during the poltergeist activity and were able to take care of foster children while she was away. Tina felt as though she was no longer welcome there. So in 1986, Tina ran away from home at 16 years old. Once she was out of the house, she married an older man named James Bennett. Bennett allegedly physically abused Tina while she lived with him. She had left one unwelcoming home for another. According to Tina, James threatened her, beat her unconscious, burned her clothes to keep her from leaving, stalked and tracked her down when she tried to run away. She also alleged that he raped her. Tina was eventually able to escape James and live with her friend, but James continued to stalk her. At this point, Tina's mental health was completely deteriorating. She would forever be known as the Poltergeist girl, and now she was suffering from anxiety, depression, and PTSD. To make matters even more complicated for Tina, she soon realized she was pregnant with James Bennett's baby. On September 29th, 1988, Tina gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named Amber Gail Bennett. Tina was desperate to give Amber the childhood she never had. She gave all of her attention to Amber, never making her feel unwanted or a burden. Unfortunately for Tina, her ex-husband James continued to stalk, threaten, and harass her. He refused to sign any divorce papers that were sent to him. He called the electric company to cancel her electricity. He also made reports to child services that Tina was abusing their daughter. James and Tina finally divorced in 1990, and Tina and Amber moved in with Tina's new boyfriend, Larry Boyer. Larry and Tina married later that year, and after a few months of marital bliss, Tina finally thought she finally had her perfect family. Months into their marriage, Larry began to physically beat Tina. Larry never hurt baby Amber, but she started to worry that he might one day. A social worker told Tina that if she didn't leave the abusive relationship soon, the state would most likely take Amber away. That would mean that not only would Tina no longer have custody of her daughter, but her daughter would most likely end up in foster care and in a home like the one Tina grew up in. Tina refused to let that happen. One night, when Larry was away, she and Amber hopped on a bus to Georgia in order to escape. Tina and Amber moved to Carrollton to be close to the paranormal researchers she had grown close with in her teen years, William Roll and Janine Lange. With William and Janine's help, Tina found an apartment, signed up for food stamps, and even started to take classes at a local community college. Tina made some money transcribing notes for Janine, but Tina struggled to find another job. In 1992, Tina started dating a man named David Heron. David had a daughter around the same age as Amber, and the two kids became fast friends. Unable to afford childcare, Tina began to leave Amber with David and his daughter so that she could work during the day. Tina had to often remind David that Amber needed to be watched carefully, because like her mother, she was extremely clumsy and prone to accidents. Amber constantly had bumps and bruises all over her. On April 14th, 1992, Tina left Amber with David and his daughter so that she could transcribe notes for Janine. At around 12:30 that afternoon, David called Janine, saying that Tina needed to come to his home right now. Tina rushed to his home and David met her outside. David couldn't wake Amber from her nap. Tina tried waking Amber up, but she couldn't. Even worse, Amber did not appear to be breathing. Less than an hour later, Tina burst through the doors of the local hospital carrying Amber. She was screaming for help. Soon after her arrival, 3-year-old Amber was declared dead. Her cause of death was blunt force trauma to her head. Tina believed the trauma came from an incident that happened the day before. Apparently, while Tina was at work, David fell asleep while watching Amber and she fell down the stairs. But doctors were not so sure of Tina's story. While Tina was not at the house when Amber died, Amber was covered in bruises, indicating that she was being abused. Tina and David were both arrested on child abuse charges the next day. Now, up until this point, we have known Tina to be a loving mother to Amber, but the police's investigation into Amber's death would reveal a much more sinister side to the woman once called the Poltergeist girl. So in part 2, we are going to dive deep into the investigation into the death of Amber Bennett, and try to see if Tina is an innocent woman with an extremely unlucky life, or the ultimate con artist. In the meantime, stay safe, strangers, and thanks for listening. This episode was written by Alexa Morrissey. Stranger in the House is a Boy Wonder production. All our sources will be linked in the show notes.